The Cuban Missile Crisis took place during the height of the Cold War, a period of intense political and military rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union that lasted from the end of World War II until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. During this time, the two superpowers engaged in a global struggle for dominance, both militarily and ideologically, as they sought to spread their respective political systems around the world. The tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union were fueled by a number of factors, including ideological differences, economic competition, and military buildups. The United States was a capitalist democracy, while the Soviet Union was a communist dictatorship. These fundamental differences in political systems made it difficult for the two sides to find common ground, and each side viewed the other with suspicion and mistrust. In addition to their ideological differences, the United States and the Soviet Union also engaged in an intense arms race during the Cold War, as each side sought to develop and deploy the most advanced weapons systems in order to gain an advantage over the other. This arms race included the development and testing of nuclear weapons, which both sides saw as a crucial component of their military strategy. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a direct result of this complex and volatile international environment, as the Soviet Union sought to establish a strategic advantage over the United States by placing nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. The discovery of these missiles by the United States set off a chain of events that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, and it remains one of the most significant moments of the Cold War. At the forefront of the crisis was President John F. Kennedy, the leader of the United States. When Kennedy learned of the Soviet Union's installation of nuclear missiles in Cuba, he was faced with a difficult decision. On the one hand, he knew that the presence of these missiles posed a serious threat to the security of the United States, as they gave the Soviet Union the ability to strike at the U.S. with little warning. On the other hand, Kennedy also knew that a military response to the crisis could easily escalate into a full-blown war, with potentially catastrophic consequences. Ultimately, Kennedy decided to impose a naval quarantine around Cuba to prevent any more missiles from being delivered, and he also worked to establish a diplomatic channel with the Soviet Union in order to find a peaceful resolution to the crisis. Kennedy's leadership and diplomatic skills were crucial in helping to defuse the crisis, and his efforts helped to prevent a nuclear war. Another key figure in the crisis was Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev was the one who came up with the idea of placing nuclear missiles in Cuba, and he was instrumental in pushing for their deployment. Khrushchev saw the missiles as a way to counter the threat posed by the United States' intermediate-range missiles in Europe, and he hoped that they would give the Soviet Union a strategic advantage in the Cold War. However, Khrushchev also recognized the dangers of a nuclear war, and he was ultimately willing to negotiate with the United States in order to find a peaceful resolution to the crisis. Cuban leader Fidel Castro was also a key figure in the crisis, as he played a crucial role in helping the Soviet Union install the missiles in Cuba. Castro was a strong ally of the Soviet Union, and he saw the missiles as a way to protect Cuba from a potential attack by the United States. However, Castro also had to balance his loyalty to the Soviet Union with his desire to avoid a nuclear war, and he ultimately supported the efforts to find a peaceful resolution to the crisis. The negotiation of the 1962 Moscow-Washington hotline and the establishment of a naval quarantine around Cuba were two key diplomatic efforts that helped to resolve the Cuban Missile Crisis and prevent a nuclear war. The Moscow-Washington hotline was a direct communication link between the United States and the Soviet Union that was established in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The hotline was designed to provide a way for the two sides to communicate with each other directly and quickly in the event of a crisis, in order to avoid misunderstandings and to reduce the chances of an accidental nuclear war. The hotline consisted of two teletype machines, one in the Kremlin and the other at the White House, that were connected by a dedicated telephone line. The hotline allowed leaders from both sides to communicate directly with each other in the event of a crisis, and it helped to reduce the chances of misunderstandings and miscommunications that could lead to an accidental nuclear war. The naval quarantine around Cuba was another important diplomatic effort to resolve the crisis. This measure was taken by the United States to prevent any more nuclear missiles from being delivered to Cuba, and it involved the deployment of U.S. naval vessels to block any ships suspected of carrying missiles. The quarantine was put in place on October 22, 1962, and it involved a naval blockade of the island that was enforced by U.S. naval vessels. The quarantine helped to limit the scope of the crisis and to give the United States and the Soviet Union time to negotiate a peaceful resolution. The quarantine was successful in preventing any more missiles from reaching Cuba, and it played a crucial role in helping to defuse the crisis. Both the Moscow-Washington hotline and the naval quarantine were instrumental in helping to resolve the Cuban Missile Crisis peacefully. The hotline provided a direct and efficient way for the two sides to communicate, while the quarantine helped to contain the crisis and to give the United States and the Soviet Union time to find a peaceful solution. These diplomatic efforts helped to prevent a nuclear war and to bring an end to the crisis, which was a significant moment in the history of the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis had a significant impact on international relations, and it brought the world to the brink of a nuclear war. One of the main impacts of the crisis was the heightened tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, which were already high due to the ongoing Cold War. The discovery of the Soviet Union's nuclear missiles in Cuba brought these tensions to a boiling point as the United States and the Soviet Union faced off in a high-stakes showdown that threatened to escalate into a full-blown war. The crisis was a reminder of the dangers of the Cold War and the potential consequences of a nuclear conflict. Another impact of the crisis was the realization of the need for better communication and diplomacy between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Cuban Missile Crisis highlighted the importance of being able to communicate directly and efficiently in the event of a crisis, in order to avoid misunderstandings and to reduce the chances of an accidental nuclear war. This realization led to the establishment of the Moscow-Washington hotline, which provided a direct communication link between the two sides and helped to prevent future crises from escalating into a nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis also had a lasting impact on the way that the United States and the Soviet Union approached international relations. The crisis served as a wake-up call for both sides, and it led to a shift in the way that they dealt with each other. The United States and the Soviet Union began to focus more on diplomacy and negotiation as a way to resolve conflicts, and they worked to establish more channels of communication in order to avoid future crises. The Cuban Missile Crisis also had an impact on the international community as a whole. The crisis was a reminder of the dangers of nuclear weapons and the need for international cooperation in order to prevent a nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis also had an impact on the way that the United States and the Soviet Union approached their military strategies. The crisis demonstrated the dangers of relying too heavily on nuclear weapons as a means of deterrence, and it led both sides to rethink their strategies. In the aftermath of the crisis, the United States and the Soviet Union began to focus more on non-nuclear means of deterrence, such as conventional military forces, as a way to reduce the risk of a nuclear conflict. This shift in strategy helped to reduce tensions between the two sides and to create a more stable balance of power. The Cuban Missile Crisis also had an impact on the global nonproliferation regime, which is the set of international rules and agreements that seek to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. The crisis served as a reminder of the dangers of nuclear weapons and the need to prevent their proliferation, and it led to increased efforts to promote nonproliferation and disarmament. Overall, the Cuban Missile Crisis had a lasting impact on international relations, and it served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of nuclear weapons and the importance of diplomacy in resolving conflicts. The crisis was a reminder of the potential consequences of a nuclear war, and it underscored the need for better communication and cooperation between nations in order to prevent future crises from escalating into a full-blown conflict. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a historic event that had a significant impact on the global political landscape, and it has left a lasting legacy in terms of the lessons that were learned from the crisis. One of the key lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis was the importance of effective communication and diplomacy in resolving conflicts. The crisis demonstrated the dangers of misunderstandings and miscommunications, and it highlighted the need for better channels of communication between nations in order to prevent future crises from escalating into a full-blown war. The establishment of the Moscow-Washington hotline was a direct result of this lesson, and it has played an important role in helping to prevent future crises from escalating into a nuclear conflict. Another lesson of the Cuban Missile Crisis was the dangers of relying too heavily on nuclear weapons as a means of deterrence. The crisis demonstrated the risks of a nuclear conflict and the need for more nuanced and diverse approaches to national security. This lesson has shaped the way that the United States and the Soviet Union, and later Russia, approached their military strategies, and it has contributed to a shift away from a focus on nuclear weapons as a primary means of deterrence. The Cuban Missile Crisis also had an impact on the global nonproliferation regime, and it served as a reminder of the dangers of nuclear weapons and the need to prevent their proliferation. The crisis contributed to increased efforts to promote nonproliferation and disarmament, and it helped to shape the global political landscape in terms of the way that nations approach issues of nuclear security. Overall, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a historic event that had a significant impact on the global political landscape, and it has left a lasting legacy in terms of the lessons that were learned from the crisis. The crisis has shaped the way that nations approach issues of communication, diplomacy, and nuclear security, and it has had a lasting impact on the global political landscape.